This is Third Paradigm, and I'm Teresa Coraggio. I'm recording this on the eve of my 65th birthday, and so Medicare is much on my mind. We have been taught that when you reach Medicare, that's the holy grail. You've survived all the precarious years. Now you can actually feel free to get sick. But in fact, that idea that we wanted Medicare for all so that we would all be in that position has flipped. Instead, Medicare is now turning into Obamacare, that Medicare is being privatized. So you can have vanilla Medicare, which doesn't cover a whole lot of things and you may not be able to access anyone. Or you can have one private program through Kaiser, which in my area may mean an hour slog through traffic in order to get to an urgent care because there's no services. Or you can have the other Sutter system, which means that there are no primary care physicians. And so trying to find someone so that you can then access other things is another uphill climb. And all these things make me wonder, how do ordinary people navigate this? I have an army of people advising me and telling me horror stories and giving me conflicting advice. But I'm not alone in this. It seems like everywhere I turn, there is some gotcha that is ready to say, well, did you cancel that supplement that you had? Because if you don't, they're going to start charging you $1,200 a month for something you're not even using. And there are so many ways in which they are trying to trick us. So that's actually not the topic of my rant today. I'm going to be looking at opioids. As I was collecting stories on how our healthcare system has failed people, one of the biggest failures is the opioid infliction. And we can't call it an epidemic. An epidemic, kind of like COVID, makes it sound like something that's just found in nature. It's not a virus. It's something that has been done to people. And so I want to look at some of the personal stories that I know of from being in Appalachia, which is where my hometown is and where I travel back to work on my childhood home. So looking at some of those stories and whether this is a new opium war, whether the pharmaceutical profits are just a side hustle, but there is really something darker and more malevolent that's going on that is absolutely intentional. And when I have a question, it just seems like the universe answers me, which is why I have my little sign that says no. So as I was pondering that, I opened an article by Dr. Joseph Mercola on another layer of scandal in the opioid corruption. So I'm going to be talking about that and also citing some information from Dr. Robert Malone on what things were like just before COVID at the end of 2019. And then I want to raise a question that I don't have an answer to, that maybe I can throw out to you as the universe and see if other people have ideas on it. I've been hearing a lot of tragic stories about fentanyl, and there's something about them that just doesn't add up to me with the story that we're being told. So I want to bring up that just as questions that we should be looking at. And I want to end by looking at a comment posted by Gar on my last episode when Yuval Noah Harari says that he sees drugs and computer games as what the masses are going to do to deal with all the boredom. And Gar points out that the Rat Park experiment showed that drugs were necessary for dealing with a dysfunctional world, but when you actually had a system that works and you had the things that you needed in life, including healthy stimulation and interaction and relationships, you didn't need the drugs. So let's look at this. I grew up in Appalachia on the border of West Virginia, and that's another place where poverty is not endemic but inflicted. And I talk about this in my episode, How Whites Were Trashed. I talk about a book called Ramp Hollow, The Ordeal of Appalachia, who traces the whole history of land theft and making the people dependent, going back to Alexander Hamilton in the service of his financial master, Robert Morris. So in Appalachia, there is a lot of opioid addiction. And there are many stories that I've heard from people that I know and people that they know. In every case, it was something that started with a medical emergency, but opioids were prescribed. And from what I've heard, the withdrawal from them is a worse pain than what they originally went through, that they have said that they would trade it. They would go back through the pain of what they endured with the accident rather than have to endure the pain of withdrawal. So that's something that is true in Appalachia, but isn't just true there. Here, I have a dancer friend, and he had an accident with his foot many years ago, and the doctors put him on opioids. And at some point he said, I think I need to be backed off of these. I think we need to have a plan for how I'm going to be eased off of them. And that doctor said, oh, we'll just take you off right away. And he said, well, that doesn't sound good either. So he got a second opinion. And the second doctor said, oh, no, we'll just keep you on forever. And that so horrified him that he just went cold turkey. So this is something that is happening throughout the country. And is it just for pharmaceutical profits? Or is there something else that's going on? Now let's look at what things were like before the pandemic. Robert Malone has a charming article called The Way We Were on his Substack. And in it, he goes through the last decade leading up to the pandemic. He talks about the politics that Trump was president and that there was an impeachment trial going on because he may have pressured Zelensky, someone we've never heard of, into investigating Hunter Biden. So that was something I'd completely forgotten because those names didn't mean very much to me at the time. And then he says that financially, we had, for the first time in history, gotten through a decade without an economic recession. And yet, in 1999, almost 10,000 businesses would close by the end of the year. And then he says the CDC reported a historic decline in life expectancy for the first time. And that was in part because of a 73% increase in overdoses. Of opioid addiction overdoses, there was a 30% increase just in a 14-month period from 2016 to 2017. And liver damage had increased year by year over the 10 years. So those are all things that have contributed, including suicide rate, which went up 33% in the 20-year period since 1999. Next, I want to look at Dr. Joseph Mercola. His article, Another Layer of Scandal in the Opioid Corruption, was what alerted me to the Yuval Noah Harari interview that I analyzed in my last episode. In that, he says, it's just speculation, but is the opioid addiction a part of the Great Reset? It certainly fits in with Yuval's discussion of useless eaters and superfluous people and how the drugs and computer games need to be what makes the masses more malleable, which is what he says humans are. But I'd like to take his speculation a step further. There is something very strange going on with fentanyl. My daughter, I've mentioned, works in bereavement counseling, and they operate a hotline also. And many things have been coming up that don't make sense. Some of the stories that I've heard, they're not people who are using street drugs. These are people who are taking half of a Xanax, who are trying to deal with a headache, with a panic attack, with some kind of anxiety. And it will be a person who is not a user of street drugs at all. This seems beyond diabolical because Xanax is something that people use to control their anxiety. So having that be something that is cut with fentanyl, and I looked it up, and apparently it is a thing, but there's no reason for it, because if you look at what the prices are of Xanax, you can get them for under $20 with a coupon at a local drugstore. So that's not something that people would be buying on the street. There's other things on the internet that talk about, oh, China doesn't have the same kind of control over their manufacturing process. Sounds like propaganda to me. I think this is something we should look into more and keep our spidey senses alert, because something strange is going on, and there are so many tragedies that are happening, and they're happening in a way that is cutting deep in our community. But Gar's comment reminded me that there's an antidote to all of this addiction, and that antidote is a life worth living. And that's what we're going to be putting together. It reminded me that I had done an episode on Gabor Mate called The Epiphany Jumpstart, which is one of my favorite episodes because I love Gabor Mate. And he talks about the Rat Park guy, Bruce Alexander, who did the research showing that if you take rats who are in a deprived environment and you give them access to drugs, they do nothing but take the drugs. But as soon as you put them in a space where they have things to play with and friends to play with, then they ignore the drugs. They go for real food. And I think that that's what we can accomplish. Gabor is also the father of Aaron Mate, who I often quote on these episodes. And when I looked that up, I found that there was a video of the two of them discussing Russiagate that Caitlin Johnstone calls the best political video she's ever seen. So our worlds are converging, and they're converging in a way that's going to bring about something so much better. So if you want to look at how we got here, here is how whites were trashed, and here is the one on Gabor Mate called The Epiphany Jumpstart. Thank you for subscribing, and please check out my Substack where I can include links and videos and quotes. Thank you.